Paperwork smells like bureaucracy and cowardice. Anyone who has spent enough time in a hospital knows that the most dangerous weapon on the floor is never a scalpel. It is a complaint form. And in the 48 hours before Brigadier General James Webb walked through the sliding glass doors of Riverside General in full-dress uniform, 3 of those forms had been filed against the same man. His name was Marcus Cole. He was a nurse. The fluorescent lights in the emergency department hummed at a frequency that most people tuned out within their first week on the job. Marcus had never tuned it out. He used it. The hum was a baseline, a resting heartbeat of the building, and any deviation from it, a flickering ballast, a new fixture installed down the corridor, registered in his peripheral awareness, like a compass needle shifting. He had learned to read rooms the way other people read books. Quickly, completely, and without moving his eyes. He was 38 years old. His scrubs were navy blue, always pressed, always the same. He wore a long-sleeved thermal undershirt beneath them regardless of the season, which his colleagues had chalked up to a circulation issue or some personal quirk. They had not looked closely enough to see that the sleeves covered forearms mapped with the kind of scarring that does not come from clumsiness or kitchen accidents. He kept his badge clipped low on his left breast pocket. He kept his voice below the ambient noise of the department whenever possible. He had worked the night shift at Riverside General for 2 years, and in that time had cultivated a reputation for being dependable, invisible, and not particularly impressive. Dr. Raymond Harrington had a different word for it. Cole. Harrington did not look up from the chart in his hand when he said the name. He had a habit of speaking at people rather than to them, a talent he had refined across 22 years of emergency medicine and had mistaken for authority. The patient in Bay 7 reported that you told him his chest pain was cardiac in origin. I have already documented musculoskeletal inflammation secondary to his recent landscaping work. You are a nurse. You do not diagnose. Marcus was restocking a medication cart 3 feet away. He did not stop what he was doing. I didn't diagnose him, he said. I asked you to order a CT angiogram before you closed his chart. Which I declined, because it is unnecessary and it wastes imaging resources. He's sweating through a 68-degree room, Marcus said. His pain is radiating to his jaw. His pressure in the right arm is 14 points lower than the left. Harrington finally looked up. His expression was the particular brand of condescension that is only achievable by men who have never once questioned whether they might be wrong. Are you a cardiologist now, Cole? No, sir. Marcus closed the cart drawer with a quiet click. I'm a nurse, and I'm asking you to order the scan. Harrington ordered it 40 minutes later, under pressure from the attending on-call who had wandered past Bay 7 and noticed the patient's color. The CT showed a type A aortic dissection, a tear in the wall of the body's largest artery, the kind of diagnosis that, missed, produces a death certificate within hours. The patient was in the operating room before midnight. Harrington filed the complaint the next morning. Unauthorized diagnostic overreach, failure to remain within scope of nursing practice, a threat to the hierarchical structure of patient care. Marcus read the form when HR sent him a copy. He folded it in thirds and put it in his locker. Then he went back to work. The second incident happened 4 days later, on a Thursday, at 11:15 at night. The paramedics brought in a young man with a gunshot wound to the upper chest. He was 22 years old, and he had been in the wrong parking lot at the wrong time, and the bullet had entered just below his right clavicle at a downward angle that suggested the shooter had been elevated, a car roof, a stairwell, a second-floor window. Marcus noted all of this automatically, the way a man notes weather, without deciding to. The young man's name was Darnell. His blood pressure was crashing. His breath sounds on the right were absent. The duty surgeon was 8 minutes out. Head nurse Linda Patterson blocked the door to Trauma Bay 2 with her body. Not with malice exactly, with the particular rigidity of a person whose entire professional identity rests on the enforcement of protocol. The surgeon is almost here, Cole. You step back and you let the team prep. His trachea is shifting left, Marcus said. He was not looking at Patterson. He was looking at Darnell's throat. "The surgeon has 8 minutes," Marcus said. "Darnell has 2. Maybe. You are not authorized to perform a needle decompression in this department without a physician present." Marcus looked at her then. He looked at her the way a man looks at a locked door. He has decided not to kick in, because kicking it would cause unnecessary damage, and he is patient, and he has time, and then he looks again and realizes he does not have time. "Linda," he said, very quietly, "move." She did not move. He moved around her. He found the second intercostal space by feel, the way he had learned to find it in the dark, in the back of a vehicle moving at speed, with noise and dust, and the specific human sound of someone running out of air. The needle went in clean. The hiss of decompressing air was immediate and significant. By the time the trauma surgeon arrived 7 minutes and 40 seconds later, Darnell's oxygen saturation had climbed from 61% to 94%, and his blood pressure had stabilized enough to move him to the OR without the crash cart. The surgeon, a meticulous and fair-minded woman named Dr. Okafor, had looked at Marcus across the gurney with an expression he recognized. It was the expression of a professional acknowledging competence in another professional. She said nothing. She did not need to. Patterson filed her complaint before the end of the shift. Insubordination. Willful violation of department protocol. Dangerous and reckless intervention without physician authorization. Marcus received his copy at the nurse's station. He folded it in thirds. He put it in his locker, on top of the first one. Then he went back to work. The third incident was not medical. It happened at 7:40 in the morning, during the overlap between the night shift and the day shift, when the department was at its most chaotic and its least supervised. A man in his early 40s had been brought in by his family for what the intake form described as acute psychological distress. He had been waiting in Bay 4 for 3 hours, agitated and escalating, while the overnight psychiatry resident tried to reach an attending by phone. At some point during that wait, the man had gotten off the bed, crossed to the adjacent bay, and picked up a number 10 scalpel from an unattended procedure tray. He had the blade pressed to the throat of a 24-year-old nursing assistant named Priya before anyone on the day shift had processed what was happening. Marcus was at the medication dispensing unit 12 feet away. He heard the sound of Priya's intake of breath. Sharp, involuntary, the specific sound of a person who has just understood that they are in genuine danger, and he turned around. What happened next took approximately 2 seconds. He crossed the distance without running, because running would have startled the man. He spoke the man's name, which was on the whiteboard above Bay 4, in a low and even register. He kept his hands visible and open, and when he was close enough, he used a wrist lock technique that the United States Army teaches to soldiers who need to disarm someone without killing them, applied with exactly the amount of pressure required to cause acute pain and motor failure in the hand without fracturing the bones. And he brought the man's arm down and around, while his other hand removed the scalpel from fingers that had already let go of it, and he had the man face down on the floor with his wrists controlled before the security guard at the end of the corridor had finished unclipping his radio. Priya stood against the wall, breathing hard, completely unharmed. The security chief, a former mall cop named Morrison who took his title with a seriousness that the title did not quite support, filed the complaint by 9 a.m. Excessive force, unauthorized physical intervention, creating a hazardous situation by engaging rather than retreating. A liability to the department and to the hospital. 3 complaints, 48 hours. Marcus Cole folded the third one in thirds, opened his locker, and placed it on top of the other 2. He stood there for a moment in the quiet of the break room, looking at the stack of paper. He was very tired, not from the shift. He had worked longer and harder than this in places where the tiredness had a different texture altogether, where it burrowed into the cellular level and stayed there permanently, a companion you learn to live with rather than overcome. He was tired of the particular exhaustion of being underestimated. It was a different kind of weight. It did not diminish you the way the other kind did. It did something subtler. It made the world very small and very slow, like living inside a photograph of a life, rather than inside the life itself. He poured himself a cup of the terrible break room coffee. He drank it standing at the window, watching the parking lot turn gold in the early morning light. Then he went home, slept 4 hours, and came back for his next shift. He was at the nurse's station the following morning, charting, when the sound reached him. Not everyone heard it at first. The charge nurse that morning was a young man named Kevin who was dealing with a backed-up waiting room and a malfunctioning printer and had no available bandwidth for anything outside his immediate crisis radius. The residents didn't hear it. The nursing assistants didn't hear it. Marcus heard it while he was in the middle of typing a medication note, and his fingers stopped moving over the keyboard, and he became very still, in the particular way that prey animals become still when they hear something in the underbrush that does not fit the pattern of the afternoon. It was a rhythmic, low-frequency percussion, not the high, frantic chop of the civilian medevac helicopters that occasionally use the hospital's rooftop pad. This was heavier, more deliberate. It displaced the air rather than slicing it. It resonated through the building's frame like a tuning fork struck against concrete. That was a UH-60 Blackhawk. And by the way, the sound layered. The slight syncopation of overlapping rotors. There was not one. There were two. Marcus placed his hands flat on the desk. He breathed out slowly through his nose. It had been 3 years since he had heard that sound outside of the context of a nightmare, and his body did not know the difference. His heart rate spiked exactly the way it had on 47 separate occasions in a country on the other side of the world, and he had to tell it, silently and firmly, to stand down. The printer behind Kevin jammed. Kevin swore. 2 orderlies argued about a patient transfer in the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless bass line. And then the sliding glass doors of the ambulance bay blew open. They did not open. They blew open, struck from the outside by a force of absolute forward momentum, the doors swinging back hard against their frames, with a crack of aluminum against aluminum. The smell that came in with the men was the smell of Marcus Cole's other life, aviation fuel, cordite, sweat that had been earned rather than accumulated. The particular copper-iron tang of blood that has already started to oxidize in open air. 4 of them. Full tactical gear, plate carriers over combat shirts, sand still in the folds of their sleeves from somewhere Marcus could identify by climate and color, and would not name. They were carrying a litter between them. The man on the litter was unconscious, his face the color of old concrete, a tourniquet twisted agonizingly tight into his right thigh, and a field dressing that had long since been saturated pressed against a wound in his abdomen. A 5th man walked beside the litter with his hand on the casualty's shoulder, talking to him low and steady, saying the things you say to a man who cannot hear you, because it is the only available act of loyalty. The department froze. Kevin stared at the men the way people stare at car accidents. Dr. Harrington, who happened to be passing the nurse's station, took 2 involuntary steps backward. A nursing assistant dropped a clipboard, and the sound of it hitting the floor seemed very loud. The man at the head of the group, tall, dark beard, a unit patch on his left shoulder that Marcus knew the way he knew his own handwriting, stopped and scanned the room with eyes that cataloged exits and threats and the location of equipment in approximately 1 second. Then he spoke. "We need a trauma bay, and we need it now. He's got a penetrating abdominal wound, and his pressure is tanking. Where is your trauma lead?" Dr. Harrington stepped forward, because authority, even when frightened, tends to step forward. "I am the attending on duty. Let's get him into Bay 1. I need an IV team, and I need imaging." "With respect," the operator said, and his voice carried a specific cadence that indicated the phrase was being used as punctuation rather than sentiment. "We did not land 2 aircraft in your parking lot for a chest X-ray. He has a probable IVC injury. He needs someone with hands. Who here has trauma surgery experience?" Harrington's mouth moved without producing language. The operator's eyes swept the room. They moved past the residents, past the nursing assistants, past Kevin, who looked like he was considering a career change. They stopped. They stopped on Marcus Cole, who was standing at the nurse's station with his hands flat on the desk and his face entirely still. There was a beat of silence. The operator's eyes narrowed. He tilted his head approximately 2 degrees. "Iron 6, he said. It was not a question. The room went very quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. This was the quiet of a collective held breath. Marcus did not move for a moment. He looked at the man on the litter. He looked at the dressing soaked through with dark venous blood. He looked at the tourniquet and the position of the wound and the particular gray of the casualty's lips, and he ran a calculation that took less than a second and arrived at an answer that had only one variable. He pushed back from the desk and stood up. "Bay 1, Marcus said. "Move him now." He didn't look at Harrington. He moved to the cabinet under the far counter, the one no one used because it was awkwardly positioned behind the crash cart, and he opened it and pulled out a surgical kit that he had quietly restocked 3 weeks ago, with instruments that were not standard civilian issue, because 3 weeks ago he had looked at the department's inventory with the eye of a man who has been in rooms where the standard civilian kit was not enough, and had made adjustments without explaining them to anyone. "I need 2 units of O-negative hanging before we get him on the table," Marcus said, pulling on gloves. His voice was level, unhurried. It was the voice of a man who has performed this particular calibration before, who has taken the adrenaline dump, and the noise, and the pressure, and run it all through a very fine filter until only the necessary things came out the other side. "I need a suction unit and I need lighting directly overhead, and I need everyone in this room who is not useful to me to move to the far wall and stay there." Nobody argued with him. That was the thing that would stay with everyone who was present in Trauma Bay 1 that morning. Not the skill. Not the instruments. Not the blood. It was that nobody argued with him. Not the residents, not the nursing assistants, not even Harrington, who had filed a formal complaint against this man 48 hours earlier for having the audacity to notice that a patient was dying. They just moved. What happened over the next 31 minutes was not something that the civilian staff had a framework for. They watched through the bay window, those who could bear to look, and saw a nurse work in the way that a certain kind of person works when the ceiling has come off the world, and there is nothing left but the task in front of them and the unbreakable decision to complete it. His hands moved with an economy that registered as inhuman to people accustomed to watching surgeons perform with the full infrastructure of an operating room behind them. He controlled the bleeding. He identified the source. He packed the cavity with a precision that Dr. Okafor, who had been paged and arrived at the 7-minute mark, would later describe to a colleague as the finest field trauma work she had seen outside of a published case study. The casualty's pressure stabilized at the 19-minute mark. His color began to return at 23. Dr. Okafor took over at 31 minutes and prepared him for transport to the OR. Marcus stepped back. He stripped his gloves off and dropped them in the biohazard bin. He was absolutely covered in blood from the wrists down. His long sleeves, pushed up to the elbows for the procedure, revealed the topography of his forearms, the layered scarring, the faded tattoo on the left forearm that anyone with specific knowledge would identify as the unit crest of the 75th Ranger Regiment. The operator, his name was Torres, and he had served with Marcus in Kunar Province, and he had been shot twice in that time, and both times Marcus Cole's hands had been the reason he was still alive to be shot, stood in the corner of the bay and watched the man he had been looking for across 2 years and 4 countries. He looked at the crest on the forearm. He looked at the navy blue scrubs. He looked at the plastic ID badge clipped to the chest pocket that said, in simple black letters, Cole, Marcus, RN. "You been here the whole time," Torres said. It was not a question. It was the sound of a man arriving at the end of a very long search. 2 years, Marcus said. He pulled his sleeves back down. 2 years, 3 months. Torres was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The general has been looking for you." Marcus picked up a paper towel from the dispenser and dried his hands. The paper was cheap and it shredded slightly against his palms. He had been drying his hands on paper like this for 2 years and 3 months. "I know," he said. "He's coming himself," Torres said. "Tomorrow morning. Nothing I could do to stop it." Marcus looked at the blood on the floor. It was reflecting the overhead lights in the particular way that blood reflects light in a trauma bay, and he had stood in rooms like this more times than he had ever wanted to, on 2 different continents, in 2 different lives, and the reflection was always the same. "Let him come," Marcus said quietly. He dropped the ruined paper towel in the bin and walked out of the bay, his rubber soles sticking slightly on the tacky floor, and went to the sluice room to scrub his hands properly. The water ran red, then pink, then clear. He stood at the sink for a long time after the water ran clear. 48 hours. Brigadier General James Webb arrived at 8 o'clock in the morning, which was the kind of hour that only military men and emergency nurses keep without complaint. He came in a black government sedan with a single aide and no advance notice to hospital administration, a choice that was deliberate, because Webb had spent 31 years making deliberate choices and had no intention of stopping. He was in his dress uniform. Every decoration on his chest was exactly where it was supposed to be. He walked through the sliding glass doors of Riverside General without slowing down, and the aide behind him carried a flat box of dark mahogany, and the 2 MPs flanking them stood at a spacing that had been calculated and maintained without anyone appearing to calculate or maintain it. The morning charge nurse looked up and stopped mid-sentence. Hospital Administrator Diane Walsh, who had been paged by security and had arrived in the lobby still clutching her coffee cup, stared at the 4-star cluster on Webb's shoulder and appeared to briefly forget how language worked. "I am looking for a member of your nursing staff," General Webb said. His voice was the kind of voice that was not raised and did not need to be. "His name is Marcus Cole." Walsh found her voice. She found it in the direction of the ER, where she pointed. Webb walked into the emergency department at the shift change, which meant the floor was full. Day shift nurses, night shift nurses finishing their charting, residents coming on, residents going home. The full ecology of the department in its most populated hour. Marcus was at the corner workstation, his back to the room, completing his medication reconciliation for the previous shift. He was wearing his navy scrubs. His badge was clipped low on his left breast pocket. His sleeves were down. He heard the footsteps coming across the linoleum, and he did not turn around. "Staff Sergeant Cole," General Webb said. The entire department stopped. There was no dramatic signal, no collective decision. It simply stopped, the way a room stops when something enters it that has sufficient gravity to reorganize everything else around it. Marcus saved his charting. He placed his pen on the desk in a deliberate and unhurried way. He turned around in his chair. He stood up. He and James Webb looked at each other across 8 feet of hospital linoleum, and between them, invisible and crushing and permanent, was Kunar Province, Afghanistan, July of 3 years ago. A casualty collection point in a collapsed building, 7 critically wounded Rangers, 4 hours of sustained contact, and a staff sergeant who had been shot through the left forearm in the 2nd hour and had kept working for the following 3. "Sir," Marcus said. "At ease," Webb said. His voice was not rough. It was very clean, actually, the way voices get when something important is being said, and the person saying it wants to make sure none of the weight gets lost. "You're a hard man to find, Marcus." "I wasn't hiding, sir." "No." Webb looked around the department, at the nurses, at the doctors, at Walsh, who had followed him in and was hovering near the admissions desk, with her coffee cup held against her chest, like a shield, at the stack of printed complaint forms that Kevin had inadvertently left on the corner of the nurses' station, which Webb's aide had noted without appearing to note. No, I don't think you were hiding. I think you were working. He paused. Same as you always were. His aide stepped forward and placed the mahogany box on the workstation beside Marcus. Webb opened it himself. Inside, resting on a bed of blue velvet, was the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest decoration for valor in combat. Beside it, folded into a precise square, was a letter on cream-colored paper bearing a letterhead that several people in the room would later describe in phone calls to their families that evening, struggling to convey what it had felt like to see it in person on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a hospital break room. 7 Rangers, Webb said. Every one of them alive. 3 of them are officers now. 1 is serving at the White House. None of them ever stopped asking where you went. He looked at Marcus. You never put yourself in for anything. There was a lot of noise, Marcus said. I just did my job. No, Webb said, with the firmness of a man correcting a statement that matters. You did our job, and then you came back here and did theirs too. And apparently you've been doing it so well that people keep filing paperwork about it. He glanced at the complaint forms on the counter. The corner of his mouth moved approximately 2 millimeters. 3 complaints in 48 hours. I've seen combat records that looked worse. There was a sound from somewhere behind Marcus. He thought it might have been Harrington, but he did not look. Webb lifted the Distinguished Service Cross from the box. On behalf of the Army of the United States, he said, and his voice was steady and deliberate and carried to every corner of the room, and the 7 men who came home because of what you did in that valley, and the men you kept alive in this building, without anyone knowing to be grateful, I am proud to present you with this decoration. He pinned it to the chest of Marcus Cole's navy blue nursing scrubs, above the plastic ID badge that said Cole, Marcus, RN. The citation, Webb added quietly, just for him, mentions a nurse who refused to leave his post. I thought that was appropriate. Marcus stood very straight. His hands were at his sides. His face was a composition that the people watching him would describe differently later, because it was too many things at once, and they each saw the one that corresponded to something inside themselves. Some saw dignity, some saw grief. Priya, the nursing assistant who had been held at knife point 2 days ago and was standing near the medication cabinet in the particular way of someone who has not yet fully processed a frightening thing, saw something she could not name but that made her eyes sting. Webb stepped back. He delivered a crisp, formal salute. His aide and both MPs snapped to attention behind him and saluted in unison. Marcus raised his right hand and returned it. The Distinguished Service Cross caught the light of the fluorescent fixtures. It sat somewhat incongruously above the laminated badge and the navy blue fabric, and yet it looked, in a way that no one in the room could have predicted, exactly right. Exactly where it belonged. Webb held the salute for 3 seconds, which is longer than protocol requires, and exactly as long as it takes to say something without saying it. Then he dropped his hand, nodded once, and walked out of the emergency department the way he had walked in, steadily, without looking back. The automatic doors slid shut behind him. The silence lasted approximately 5 seconds. Then a monitor in Bay 3 alarmed for a low battery, and Kevin moved to silence it, and an orderly pushed a wheelchair down the hall, and the ordinary world reassembled itself around the extraordinary thing that had just occurred inside it. The way it always does, because the ordinary world is persistent and unsentimental, and has places to be. Marcus Cole picked up his pen. He turned back to his workstation. He pulled up his charting screen. He looked at the medication reconciliation he had been completing when the general arrived. He found his place. He began to type. The complaint forms on the edge of the nurses' station sat exactly where Kevin had left them. Nobody touched them. At some point during the morning, they slipped off the corner of the counter and landed on the floor beside the trash can, and at some later point, they went into the trash can, and at no later point did anyone retrieve them. Harrington walked past the workstation at 9:15 without stopping. He said nothing. He did not look at the medal on Marcus's chest. which was perhaps the most significant thing he had done in some time. Priya came over at 9:30 and refilled Marcus's coffee without being asked. She set it on the desk beside his keyboard. She started to walk away, then stopped. "3 complaints," she said. Marcus said. He did not look up from the screen. "For saving 3 people." He finished typing a line. He saved the entry. Then he looked at the terrible break room coffee in its paper cup and picked it up and drank from it. "The paperwork always catches up eventually," he said. He placed the cup back down and turned back to his screen. "So does everything else." Priya looked at the decoration on his chest. She looked at his face. She looked at the way his hands moved over the keyboard. Steady, economical, certain. And she thought about the 2 seconds in Bay 4 when the world had been very sharp and very dangerous, and then had not been, and she understood, in the particular way of someone who has just been standing next to something extraordinary without knowing what it was, that she had always been safe. She went back to work. Marcus Cole charted his medications. The fluorescent lights hummed. The monitors beeped. Somewhere down the hall, someone was asking about discharge paperwork, and someone else was answering, and the emergency department of Riverside General moved forward through the morning the way it always moved, carrying its weight of human need from one hour to the next without stopping, because it never stopped, and the people inside it were the reason it didn't. Some of them wore their medals where people could see them. Most of them didn't. If Marcus Cole's story reminded you that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one carrying the most, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to The Last Nurse for more stories about the people who stand between us and the worst moments of our lives. Not because anyone asked them to, but because they cannot do otherwise. Drop a comment below. What would it have taken for you to recognize someone like Marcus? We'll see you in the next one.